Welcome to our listeners. Thank you for joining this podcast from Argus, a leading provider of energy and commodity price benchmarks and market intelligence. We track and discuss the markets and prices that move our world. My name is Eduardo Gonzales, and I am the U.S. Grains and Oilseeds analyst here at Argus. Today in our podcast, we will be discussing how the USDA arrives at their August WASDE corn and soybean yields. I'm joined here today with Scott Irwin. Thank you for joining us, Scott, here today.
Really excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. Always welcomed. If just, I guess, as an initial background, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Briefly, my life story is I grew up on a grain and livestock farm in Iowa, which my family still operates, and I involved on the management side. And I've been a professor of agricultural economics now going on 40 years. I study kind of all things grain and commodity markets, with an emphasis on futures markets and analyzing prices, things like that. And in recent years, I'm actually spending a lot of my time on biofuels markets and policy.
Okay, very interesting. And I guess given your background, I mean, we'll just jump right into it. With the USDA WASDE report coming out on Monday, August 12th. I guess the first question is, what is the significance of this report in particular, the August one, compared with the other ones in the other months?
Yeah, great question. It's important to understand the entire sequence of crop production estimates that come under the heading of USDA. The forecasting cycle for a marketing year starts in May before harvest. And in May, June, and July, the production reports are the responsibility of the World Agricultural Outlook Board. And it's basically a simple trend forecast for corn and soybean yields, maybe adjusted for planting progress, whether it's running ahead or behind the typical pace. But it's largely a trend forecast based on a statistical model. Then starting in August, a different USDA agency takes over called NASS, which stands for National Agricultural Statistics Service. And their methodology is completely different than the simple statistical trend model methodology that the World Ag Outlook Board uses in May through July. Starting with this August crop report, it's the first major survey-based estimate of yield and production that the USDA makes for corn and soybeans. It's a massive survey enterprise, and because it has that rigorous foundation in survey methods, it tends to have a major impact in the markets.
Okay, interesting. So when you mentioned that it's a survey, is it literally sending out a survey to the farmers in the U.S. asking them what they anticipate their yield and production numbers to be, or is the model taking weather or any other variables into account?
And this is where we really kind of get into the fine details that really matter in interpreting the yield and production estimates that will come out in the August crop report this year. So how the USDA does it, I call it opening up the black box. And in August, they conduct basically a Corn Belt extended survey of thousands of farmers. And based on those responses, they will make state and then a national estimate of harvested acreage and yield and production for corn and soybeans in that August report. So that's what happens in August. It's what they call a farm operator survey. Now, through 2019, the USDA did a second survey in August, which is called the Objective Yield Survey. And maybe the best way to think about that survey is it's kind of ground truthing what the farmers are reporting in their survey indications of acreage, yield, and production. In the farm operator survey, the USDA actually employs individuals called enumerators that go out to randomly assigned fields within a state and take measurements like population and number of ears, number of pods, etc. They're literally doing yield checks, and it's a very systematic process. Obviously, that's very expensive to do, so the sample size tends to be much smaller for the objective yield survey. And so 2019 and before, what the USDA basically did is averaged those two surveys. But for expense reasons, they dropped the objective yield survey in August, starting in 2020, if I have the years right. And so now we only get in August the farm operator survey numbers. And starting in September, with the September crop production estimates, that will reflect both the farm operator survey and the objective yield survey. And then they'll repeat that in October and November. And that's how it proceeds. In terms of the surveys, that's the main data that the USDA uses. A big question is, that's constantly discussed in the market is, well, what other data might the USDA use? And we can dive into that if you want to.
Sure. I mean, that seems, yes, extremely interesting. I mean, what is the data? What other data are they using then for their projections?
Well, one thing that's always confusing to people is when the USDA, whatever estimates that they report for yield and production for corn and soybeans, it's an as of August 1 growing conditions number. They always assume that growing conditions will be normal or average the remainder of the season. So there are no weather forecasts whatsoever in the estimates that come out in August, because they always assume that it's going to be normal the rest of the year. You could be in the worst drought of the century and they would assume normal weather conditions the rest of August and September. So that's easy. The easy part is there's no weather data. The USDA, probably for the last 5 or 6 years, has also been reporting data on a satellite based yield estimate in the public materials that they provide. So they also have an estimate that is available from this satellite remote sensing system that they have. They're not actually very clear on how much weight that is given in the final published estimates. My conversations with the NASS officials is that it isn't actually given a lot of weight. It's just used at the margin as supplemental information. But a lot of people in the trade want to believe, that some crop conditions model or this satellite model is dominating the estimation process in any given year. That kind of tends to happen when the USDA surprises with a number. But I think the safest way to think about it, and I really believe this because the statisticians at NASS are very good, and they're classically trained statisticians. They believe in their randomized survey system that they've developed over many, many decades. And so the vast majority of the weight in the published estimates for yield and production are based on those two yield indicators from the farm operator survey and or the objective yield survey, with maybe sprinkled in a little bit of influence from this satellite-based yield model that they now have.
That's interesting. So then for the August yield forecast, historically, how accurate has that been compared to what the final kind of number we get at the end of the year?
It's a reasonably accurate. I think the way I'd really want to answer that question is, despite a lot of chatter you will always hear challenging the USDA's estimates every August, almost instantaneously, if you look at objective data, they're very, very hard to beat. And, it's usually within a few percent of the final yield and production numbers. And they present a significant challenge for anyone in the private sector who thinks that they can beat the USDA's accuracy over the long run. And I think a really interesting question is, what's the source of their magic?
Right. What is the source?
I kind of, there's a leading question there, wasn't it?
Yes.
Or comment. I think that there are probably a couple, maybe three reasons why, despite all the chatter, the market reacts strongly. I mean, it's not unusual, for the USDA August crop production report to move prices by plus or minus 5%, almost instantaneously after the report is released. That should tell you what, the money thinks of the accuracy of those numbers. So why is that the benchmark, despite all the complaining that you hear every year about the numbers? One, very simple, they take the largest survey of anyone in terms of collecting the data. They have thousands of objective yield samples when that starts in September, and then tens of thousands of farmers that are surveyed in August and subsequent reports. So they're spending the most money, and they have by far and away the largest sample of anybody that's trying to do this. Second, their survey procedures have been fine-tuned over decades and decades and decades. Third, and I think very much underappreciated factor, is that the response rates for farmers is astonishingly high. 20, 30 years ago, it was, 80% response rates by farmers to these surveys. Now it's probably closer to maybe the 55 to 60% response rate. They have been falling over time, but that's still an enormously high response rate for a randomized survey. So that makes a huge difference in reducing their survey sampling errors. So that's the surveys themselves. And then another really important kind of source of the magic once you get inside the black box is that over the decades that the USDA has been making these surveys, they've been able to determine something really interesting as an empirical tendency. The farm operator survey almost always, particularly in August, gives yield indications that are too high. And that's not farmers trying to fool anybody. Farmers, including, my father when he was alive, and maybe my family still when I go out. I was just there a couple weeks ago and we were starting to make some yield estimate. Farmers naturally and with good reason, before the growing season is over, tend to be conservative in their yield projections. But the USDA knows that and has observed that over many decades. So you get an objective yield indicator that's too high, and you can then subtract that bias when you're using that farm operator survey indication. On the other side, and now that this applies to September, in a very fascinating phenomenon, in my opinion, the objective yield indication, when they collect all their data and they run it through all their statistical models, is routinely too high. We could get into a long, lengthy discussion of why on earth does that happen, because these are USDA employees going out to the field, collecting the data in randomly selected spots and very precise measurements. They send all the physical ears and soybean plants to a lab in St. Louis. It all gets analyzed. Yet when they run it through all their models, it's always too high. And so they have to lower, that bias in the objective yield survey numbers. But here's kind of, the ultimate magic is that the biases in the farm operator survey too low, and the bias in the objective yield indication too high, they tend to offset. And that means that, you have two surveys, you understand the bias, they tend to offset, and that's where the magic happens.
That's that's very interesting. In terms of the survey, you mentioned that USDA received a 60% response rate. What percentage of farmers do they send it out to? Is it 100% of the farmers, or 90%, or would you happen to know?
No, nowhere near that, because that would just be prohibitively expensive. I'd have to look up, but I think that they send the August crop report to maybe 20 or 30,000 farmers out of, they may have, a survey list of someplace between 1.5 and 2 million farm operations. So it's a small percentage of the total number of farm operations.
But they're still, as you mentioned before, though, but they're still receiving a high response rate, which makes the survey valid.
Exactly. It's, extraordinary. I don't know of any other kind of survey that in the economics area where it's not required reporting by law. It is important to remember that farmers, there's no law that says you have to comply, whereas you take something like the EIA's weekly data on gasoline supply, stocks, etc. there's a federal law that says the surveyed firms there must comply. That does not apply to farmers. This is all due to the uh, good relationship that the USDA has established with farmers over more than a century now in doing this kind of work, and it's really kind of extraordinary.
And then for the August report, so we were talking about yield and production. For production, it's yield times acres. My understanding is that in the August report now, the USDA might adjust acres, or they have the ability to adjust it based on, I guess, some change recently. So my understanding is that in the August WASDE report, the USDA can potentially change the acreage number. That there was some reporting that changed within the past couple of years that now in August they can change it, where historically it might have been in September.
Right. That's referring to data from the Farm Service Agency that is collected as a part of farmers' annual reporting on their acreage for the what are called Title I farm programs. It's just the Farm Bill subsidies is that reporting. So what happens is that the USDA actually makes their biggest survey of the year in June, and that's to help them nail down acreage. So in June, it's only an acreage survey, and they take the biggest survey of the year, actually, much a bit larger than the surveys for the August crop production report, because they want to nail down the acreage part of production as accurately as possible once planting is done. And so that's a very important report that also moves markets typically quite a lot. But in some years, there can be weather events like what we've had in the northern parts of the Corn Belt, where we had tremendous rain in late May and June that basically drowned it out quite a bit of the crops, and maybe fields were left barren or replanted to something else. So the USDA can make a small survey in those particular areas and adjust acreage estimates a little bit from that source in the August report. They can also what they call true up their acreage estimates from this independent acreage data that is gathered from the FSA, or Farm Service Agency, as a part of the Title I Farm Bill reporting that farmers do. So that's the acreage side. I think generally that's now happening in September, because there's just takes a little while for the reports to all come in and be finalized. But it does depend on the year. I think, for example, last year, I don't believe there was any change in the harvested acreage estimates for corn and soybeans in the August production report. But definitely that FSA data is important for marginally what the USDA calls truing up their June acreage estimates.
Okay. I mean, this was definitely very informative, because it is something that we always hear about in terms of the August WASDE. I know that's always a kind of key WASDE report that people look at because of the farm operator survey. Are there any do you have any last kind of closing thoughts or other nuances that we should be aware of with the August WASDE report?
Well, I always think this is kind of interesting because, I guess I would say there's particularly among farmers, always a lot of conspiracy theories about the USDA estimates. Here's something that I know is a fact. The NASS, that is responsible for the survey acreage, yield, and production estimates for corn and soybeans that will come out this August, that process is hermetically sealed from the other agencies within USDA for obvious security reasons. The WASDE supply and demand estimates for 2024-25 for corn and soybeans that are going to come out in, I think,
August.
a little over a week. The WASDE balance tables that everybody talks about, those are the responsibility of the World Ag Outlook Board and the analyst at that agency. They do not get any early peeks at the NASS data. The report comes out at noon Eastern time. So the WASDE report and the crop production report are released simultaneously in August, September, October, and November for corn to soybeans. And the WASDE World Ag Outlook Board analysts only get the NASS revised acreage yield and production estimates a few hours before noon. And it is just literally emailed to them in some kind of secure system, and they have to kind of scramble then to adjust all of their balance sheet estimates in light of that. They have no ability to go back and ask the NASS statisticians, well, this is a big surprise. How'd you get that number? People don't understand. They are completely separate processes. So people say, oh, the WASDE production estimate came out today, and they'll think that the same people were responsible, say, for the corn feed and residual estimate on the 24-25 balance sheet as the production estimates. Not true. Completely different agencies, completely different processes, completely different people, and they are not allowed to talk to each other.
I was not aware of that. That's extremely interesting. So you're saying that NASS, the information they provide to them is the acres, the yields, and production for the U.S. And then
yes,
a couple hours before the report, and based on that, the World Agricultural Outlook Board then has to make adjustments to the global balance sheet, be it through the demand side for the U.S. or be it through some other countries or something along those lines.
Exactly. And they only have a few hours to do it.
Right.
And so that's something I don't think is really appreciated enough. That is the way the process works.
Yes, that I was not aware of that. That's extremely interesting. I think on that note, I mean, thank you again, Scott, for your time. We always appreciate it. We know you're pretty busy, especially with I guess now that we're in the summer season. You mentioned for your farm in Iowa. I hope everything's looking good for your crop in Iowa.
Well, yes, thanks for asking. And right now on my family farms, which are in west central Iowa, we're currently in a mode of trying to contain our enthusiasm about how big yields could be because the crops look that good. So, we're just in that stage of not trying to get our hopes up too much, but they look very good. And so it should be interesting as we get into harvest to see just how big the U.S. corn and soybean crops are going to be.
So it's funny that you mentioned you're trying to temper your excitement because you mentioned one of the biases from the farm operator survey was that always they're too negative, and I guess you just in essence kind of proved that point right there.
So I'm as guilty as any other farmer that would be filling in the surveys. It's just, when you're a producer, if you make an error in your expectations, it's much more costly if you're too optimistic rather than too pessimistic.
Right. Okay. Well, again, thank you, Scott. We definitely appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation again.